Taiwan, human rights, climate change, and COVID-19, the hot-button issues that have dominated talks between the presidents of the United States and China. Beijing has described the summit as frank, constructive, and fruitful. The leaders traded strong warnings about the future of Taiwan. Xi Jinping telling Joe Biden that encouraging Taiwanese independence would be playing with fire. Well, Mr. Biden responded by standing firm on Washington's support for the status quo. Spanning a marathon of nearly 4 hours, the highly anticipated talks touched on a range of sensitive issues, but both stressed a responsibility to avoid conflict as the world's two superpowers. Our correspondents in Beijing, Washington, Taipei, and Brussels are standing by with reactions from around the world. First, though, a look at the Chinese perspective.
总统先生你好，今天是我们第一次以视频的方式会晤，看到老朋友感到很高兴。
Smiles and waves as Chinese President Xi Jinping met his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden in a highly anticipated meeting, the first since Mr. Biden came to power in January. Chinese state media were quick to report on proceedings and keen to show a friendly atmosphere between the two leaders.
这是造福两国人民的需要，也是国际社会的期待。
In his opening remarks, President Xi said he would be willing to work with President Biden to build consensus and take active steps to move bilateral relations forward in a positive direction. Although he also emphasized that both sides need to respect each other, coexist peacefully, and pursue win-win cooperation.
当前中美发展都处在关键阶段，人类是一个地球村。 我们面临着诸多的挑战。中美作为世界前2大经济体和联合国安理会的常任理事国，应该加强沟通和合作。
Perhaps revealing the challenges of the troubled relationship, both sides seem to emphasize different points in statements released at the end of the meeting. On the issue of Taiwan, Chinese state media reported that President Xi warned that the mainland will have to take decisive measures if pro-independence forces provoke the issue or cross the red line, adding that U.S. support for Taiwanese independence would be like playing with fire.
美方应当遵守 中美间达成的正式双边协议和联合国大会以压倒性多数通过的正式决议，绝大多数国家坚持一个中国原则的事实和意志，用行动取信于中国人民，取信于国际社会。
Beijing was also keen to emphasize that President Biden stated that his government does not support Taiwan independence forces, although the White House on its part said President Biden expressed strong opposition to unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. President Biden also reportedly raised concerns over China's human rights practices in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, something that President Xi said China is willing to discuss, but only on the basis of mutual respect.
中方多次强调，包括香港在内的有关事务完全是中国内部事务，任何国家不得干涉。我们坚决反对 借人权问题干涉中国内政的行为。
But even as differences clearly remain, China and the U.S. continue to say they are open to cooperation. President Xi said both sides should find effective responses to global challenges like climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. The Foreign Ministry adding that the two leaders agreed to maintain contact, although emphasizing that both countries should take concrete action to create an enabling atmosphere.
Chinese officials have described the talks as frank, constructive, and fruitful, although as observers have predicted, there have been no major shifts in position from either side on points of contention. There have also been no tangible outcomes from the meeting, though analysts say the fact that the meeting took place in and of itself is significant, though it remains to be seen whether it has achieved its goal of dialing down tensions between the two countries. Olivia Xiong, CNA, Beijing.
For the U.S. perspective, Simon Marks joins us live from Washington, D.C. Simon, does the White House believe the summit was a success?
Well, I think as Olivia was saying at the end of her report there, the White House and Beijing will share the view that the mere fact that this meeting occurred indicates success of some variety. And the White House also points out that running nearly 4 hours, twice as long as they had initially anticipated and projected, that certainly indicates success in terms of beginning what both leaders discussed as ongoing communication and cooperation. So in those terms, definitely here the White House is able to point to a success. They've argued for months that there's no substitute for leader-level engagement between President Biden and President Xi, and now they're able to point to something more than a single phone call back in September, a concrete almost 4-hour meeting. However, the fact that the headlines here today all point out the fact that there were no concrete achievements arising from this summit, no joint statement, as reporters had been warned would be the case, no concrete deliverable moving forward, and the fact that Taiwan appears certainly to have dominated the first period of the conversation between the two leaders, with Chinese state media using that quite emotive phrase, saying that President Xi warned President Biden that if he continued interfering in Taiwan, he would be playing with fire. That definitely adds fresh complications to the relationship, although, as President Biden said last night in his opening remarks, every time he talks to President Xi, he leaves the conversation in absolutely no doubt about where the Chinese leader stands. And on that issue, at least, presumably that is very much the case as a new day dawns here in Washington.
So perhaps we have to adjust our expectations for meetings such as this. No compromises made on any of the sensitive issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, the White House, of course, has been telling everybody to adjust their expectations for days. They've been really trying to manage expectations going into this meeting. And now I think we can see clearly why they were trying to do that. The language that Chinese state media says President Xi used on Taiwan is something that I think Republicans are likely to seize on here and challenge President Biden to push back against it. The president also raised all sorts of other intractable issues in the relationship, including American claims of genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, the rollback of democracy in Hong Kong, and human rights more broadly. Interesting that two anticipated issues of possible contention were not raised by either side, according to the United States, one being the issuing of visas to journalists. The Americans particularly, it was understood, were keen to have a conversation about that. It doesn't sound as though President Biden raised it. And equally, there was no invitation to President Biden from President Xi to attend the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year. There had been enormous speculation that that invitation would be issued. It wasn't, and that spares President Biden from the potential complexity of having to respond to it. I suppose the biggest question of all, Steve, is when they talk about erecting guardrails to protect the relationship from slipping into conflict, and they talk about ongoing lines of communication, in practical leader-level terms, what does that look like? When will these two men talk again?
Indeed, we'll be watching closely. Simon Marks from the Washington, D.C.
Well, despite being a key focus of discussions, Taiwan's government has remained silent since the talks ended. The Foreign Ministry has refused to confirm local reports that Taiwan and the US would hold high-level meetings in the aftermath of the summit. Victoria Jen reports.
Taiwanese media has been closely watching the summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the U.S. President Joe Biden throughout the day. News and analysis regarding the meeting are all across news headlines, highlighting the Taiwan issue as the focal point in their virtual talks. This comes especially after China has increased its military activities near Taiwan. Against this backdrop, many Taiwanese think the summit would help ease the rising tensions across the strait.
中共跟我们的关系比较紧张，那可能也是 迫于他们内部的可能有一些压力，那他们可能也不想要走这样的局面，那可能他们也想要缓和，但是就少了可能一个台阶下之类的。那我觉得拜登这时候可能出现来缓和一下，可能有帮助这样子。
多沟通有助于情绪的缓和，是好事。台湾不要压单边，站在中间，两只大象打架呢，我们比较不会受伤。
On the issue of Taiwan, Biden has underscored that the U.S. remains committed to the One China policy, guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, and the U.S. strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the strait. Some observers say that the message that Biden is sending to China is U.S. commitment to help defend the island against China's military threat.
拜登总统在今天的拜习会特别强调的，其实是希望中方不要再不断的进行飞机绕台这些干扰动作，它会影响到台海关系。顾虑到两岸目前军力上的一种不平衡，可见的未来，美国对台的军售，不管是在质或量上面，应该都会有所转变。
But others say that Taiwan is being used as a pawn in the anti-China alliance led by the U.S., so the status quo across the strait would always be defined by Washington. The summit is generally seen as a good start for the two rivals to resolve their differences, and Taiwan will continue to play a vital role in the U.S.-China relations. Victoria Jen, CNA, Taipei.
Lucy Huff joins us live now from Brussels for The View from Europe. Lucy, how does Europe view the slight diffusing of tensions after these talks?
Well, Dawn, we haven't had any official statement from the European Union on these talks yet, but certainly the developments will have been watched with great interest. This comes just a couple of weeks after a similar call between the EU Council President Charles Michel and President Xi, talking about a number of issues, but notably trying to thaw some of those tensions that have been in place between the EU and China since March over working conditions in Xinjiang and a tit-for-tat trade war. Now, in terms of what was on the agenda during the Biden-Xi call yesterday, we know that there will be some areas that are key to the European Union, notably climate change. We know that the EU is looking to work alongside the United States to impose environmental standards on the steel industry in a united front against China's steel exports. Also, the issue of Taiwan. The EU and the US hold a similar position, wanting to reiterate the message to China that they are in support of the One China policy and don't want the status quo to be disrupted. So certainly that is a view that the EU will support. In terms of foreign policy, the situation is a little more complex. There is a feeling, we know according to a leaked EU report this week, that the US is pivoting to its focus geopolitically to Asia and specifically China at the expense of European interests, and perhaps abandoning that old transatlantic alliance, particularly on areas such as Russia, where we know the EU is looking for American support. So we do await an official line on this, but we also know that the EU is also looking to for its tensions with Beijing and is planning an EU-China summit to take place next year.
Well, meantime, Lucy, China's EU envoy has said that there won't be any compromise on hot-button issues.
That's right. We've been hearing from China's ambassador to the EU, Zhang Ming, at an event in Brussels today, saying that there really will be no compromise when it comes to those thornier issues such as Taiwan and such as that tit-for-tat trade sanctions war. Zhang Ming saying that China was not willing to change its position, that the ratification of that long sought after investment pact between the EU and China will be delayed until that sanctions program is lifted. This, as I said, was introduced back in March when the European Union announced sanctions against a number of Chinese officials and organizations working in the Xinjiang region. China then announced counter sanctions against a group of European officials. But really China saying that there will be no movement unless EU countries step back from making direct contact with Taiwan. Countries such as Lithuania, such as a delegation of European lawmakers who paid a high-profile visit to Taiwan the week before last. So an uncompromising position. Whilst there has been an agreement that there will be this summit, signs that there are still some tricky issues to resolve.
Lucy, thank you. Lucy Hough in Brussels.
The agenda might have been sensitive, but it was all smiles as the video summit began. Mr. Xi greeting Mr. Biden as his old friend at the start of the session. The expression Lao Peng Yu reflects a shared history that dates back a decade when the two traveled together in China before either reached the highest office. Mr. Biden said he would try to be more official, but noted that he's never been that formal with Mr. Xi. The U.S. leader was in the White House's Roosevelt Room for the call. He was accompanied by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and a handful of aides. Mr. Xi took the call in the East Hall of the Great Hall of the People, together with top officials from the Communist Party.